and we're a very informal group, and I think everybody in the room knows who I am. Just in case you don't, and you wonder why I'm up here, I'm Lisa Ackerman, Executive Director of Columbus Citizens Foundation, and I'm thrilled to have Vincenzo Guido tonight as our speaker, not just because he's a former scholarship recipient, which would be thrilling on its own, but because I think it's really remarkable to be out of school less than 2 years and publish a book. And I'm not sure most of us have that in us at any age. So I'm really thrilled that we're celebrating a former scholarship recipient who's doing something really tremendous to make the world a better place, and has written a book which I hope will inspire us all. And I also think some of your siblings have been former scholarship recipients, so we have a few scholarship committee members with us tonight, so I hope this makes them proud as well. And I'm only going to say, I hope you're going to tell us a little bit about what inspired you in college to get on this path. I know you've taken the LSATs recently, so hopefully in a few years we'll be celebrating you as a newly minted lawyer. And also you're working for a nonprofit, which is also doing something remarkable. And I hope that in addition to telling us a bit about the book, you'll tell us what inspired you to take the job you have, and what your hopes are for the coming years, both with your career and Rethinking Justice. So I'm turning it over to you.
Well, first of all, let me take this opportunity to thank you all for inviting me here. The Columbus Citizens Foundation has a special place in my heart and allowed me to go to Cornell University and get a robust education, which is actually where I encountered a lot of this work and was able to experience it and study it in a really meaningful way. A little bit about me: I graduated from Regis High School in 2016 when I was awarded a college scholarship, went to Cornell University. To sort of pick up what Lisa was talking about with how I got involved in this, it was actually started at Regis High School, where I met a then Jesuit priest, who wasn't a Jesuit yet, but was in formation, named Father Zach Prezzuti, who was working with an organization called Our Children, which supports women and their children, women who are coming home from prison and the unique challenges that they're facing. And for me, my only reference at this point was really watching Law & Order and just seeing what's on the news. And with this sort of interaction and the work that Father Zach was doing, it showed me that these are people, they're complex people. Some of them have made very serious mistakes. But reflecting on that in the context of my own Jesuit education, where there's a lot of emphasis on being men for others, it felt like a right fit. So I continued this when I was in college, taking coursework. Now, currently, as Lisa pointed out, I'm interested in attending law school, but right now what I'm doing is I'm part-time. I'm at Regis High School, where I help with their speech and debate program, which I did for 4 years, so I apologize if I end up speaking too quickly and get too debatey, if you will. Where I also teach a class on criminal justice to 4 students that are interested in this subject. And then I'm also the Director of Development at Thrive for Life Prison Project, which Father Zach Prezzuti now runs. And this is a transitional living community that's a house of studies to support people that want to continue the good work of college education. And we'll talk about this a little bit, but education is a remarkable ingredient, as I'm sure you guys all know, in transformation. And this applies not just to young people, but to people that are coming home and want to be contributing members of society. So I think with that, let's begin. Talk about rethinking justice. Let's see here. There we go. So just to kind of take you through a little bit of what we're going through tonight, we'll meet a gentleman who is impacted by prosecution. We'll talk a little bit about the role of the prosecutor, this sort of new mint of prosecutors, the so-called progressive prosecutor, and what lies ahead for this movement in criminal justice reform at large. And then I'll conclude with a very short reflection sort of statement. I'm obliged to say this because, as Lisa pointed out, I'm not an attorney yet, so the following remarks do not necessarily reflect the official policy or position of any prosecutor's office, company, or government agency. Any positions taken are that of myself, the author, as a private citizen, and not as an official of any representative group, as a representative of any group, agency, public servant, or company. And in no way, shape, or form should any of the following be construed as legal advice or counsel. So I'd like to start by introducing you to a gentleman named Terence Lewis. And I think the good way to do this is to read a very short excerpt from the introduction of the book. So on a dark night in 1996, 57-year-old Hewlin Howard met his demise, succumbing to gunshot wounds in what appeared to be a robbery gone wrong. Mr. Howard's girlfriend, a bystander at the scene of the murder, gave her account of the gruesome affair that led prosecutors to 3 men, one of whom was 17-year-old Terence Lewis. With her testimony, Philadelphia District Attorney Lynn Abraham, at the time, a notorious tough-on-crime prosecutor with a zero-tolerance attitude, sent detectives to bring in Mr. Lewis and 2 other compatriots. That was it. No weapons, no DNA, no photos, nothing. On the words of Mr. Howard's girlfriend, the district attorney leapt into action. There was one problem. Mr. Lewis wasn't the murderer. But that did not seem to matter. After nearly 2 years of investigations, motions, and ultimately a criminal trial, the prosecution rested as the judge sent the jury to deliberate. Life in prison without the possibility of parole. On May 24th, 1999, the gavel dropped and the now 19-year-old Mr. Lewis learned that he would die in prison. In what would prove to be only the beginning of a nearly 2-decade tragedy, Mr. Lewis spent the next 21 years behind bars for a crime he did not commit. As it turns out, the prosecutors who tried his case had seemed uninterested in the fact that their star witness, Mr. Howard's girlfriend, changed her account of the evening's events on several occasions, and that she had smoked crack cocaine shortly before the incident. Mr. Lewis, in his appeals, objected to what appeared to be a gross mischaracterization of the facts. After serving nearly 12 years behind bars and filing dozens of motions, a federal judge agreed, and quote, "The court believes that petitioner is innocent. It is more likely than not that no reasonable juror would have convicted petitioner," Mr. Lewis. But that was not the end, as the judge ruled against Mr. Lewis on procedural grounds that sent him back to prison. However, the tune began to change for Mr. Lewis in 2018 with the election of a longtime defense attorney, Larry Krasner, to Philly's chief prosecutor office. Mr. Krasner brought to his office a brand new controversial vision of prosecution that challenged the tough-on-crime model of criminal justice. Among these new initiatives was revitalizing a robust conviction integrity unit, or CIU, an internal department dedicated solely to exonerating those falsely convicted of crimes. Indeed, many of the wrongful convictions involved egregious levels of police and prosecutorial misconduct. Mr. Krasner's bold new energy proved opportune to Mr. Lewis, who managed to get his case up for review by the district attorney's CIU, under the leadership of Patricia Cummings. Ms. Cummings and her team's investigation unearthed troves of new information that prosecutors at the time withheld from Mr. Lewis's defense counsel, a flagrant miscarriage of justice that amounted to a denial of his due process rights. Among the information discovered were several detective notes that indicated inconsistencies in the key witness's testimony that had allegedly pinned Lewis as one of the assailants. Ms. Cummings found that actual records indicated that Mr. Lewis was not named as the alleged shooter, and that at least 2 other witnesses could testify that he was not among the 3 men at the scene that tragic night. With that, the Philadelphia District Attorney's Office, under new leadership, admitted that Mr. Lewis had received an unfair trial and was due reevaluation in federal court. Fortunately for Mr. Lewis, the Court of Common Pleas, a state-level court in Pennsylvania, felt there was a quicker way. Later that day, Judge Barbara McDermott vacated his conviction and the district attorney dropped all charges. Terence Lewis, after nearly 21 years behind bars, was finally a free man. Now, I tell this story and open in the book with it to sort of showcase a very critical area in which prosecutors have a tremendous amount of power, and they have a tremendous amount of responsibility to do justice and to get the right people that commit crimes, and to also correct for those mistakes when they have made mistakes, whether for reasons of negligence or being very pernicious and wanting to keep somebody behind bars because they think that that person's guilty, and it doesn't matter what the other facts are. But as we heard here, Mr. Lewis got out of prison and was welcomed home. And what's something that was really incredible in reading about his story and sort of his journey is that, a lot of people, if you did 21 years behind bars for a crime that you did not commit and were called a murderer, you would probably be pretty upset, and you may have a lot of sort of, spite against the state, against people in your community. But that's not quite what Mr. Lewis did. He went from wrongfully condemned to being a community leader. And because of his story and what he experienced, he now founded and runs an organization called the Liberation Foundation, which focuses on exonerating people that believe they're wrongfully convicted. And he's doing some incredible work, and you can see him here in this image speaking actually at a lectern at a press conference for the Philadelphia District Attorney. So I think it's important to also talk about who is the prosecutor. And a lot of us sort of have these associations that we see in the media, in the news, maybe even from own personal experience and professional experience. The prosecutor, put simply, is the lawyer that represents the government in criminal trials. And they have a couple of very unique powers in the criminal justice system that make them, as I submit, the most important, or at minimum one of the most important actors in the criminal justice system. But before talking concretely about the prosecutor, it's important to kind of understand what we're working with in the United States in framing criminal justice in America. We have 5% of the world's population in the 5% of the world's population in the United States, roughly. We house 25% of the world's known prison population. 25% of the world's known prison population is in the United States. This amounts to, depending on which metrics you look at, roughly about 2 million people that are people in jail, prison, and detention. Jail, awaiting conviction or serving very short sentences, prison being for people that are convicted and serving longer-term sentences, and detention, which usually encompasses juvenile detention, so children that are incarcerated. And again, depending on the metrics, this may include immigration centers, involuntary commitment, and things of that sort. This number actually gets much, much larger when we look at the people that are justice involved, that are on parole or probation, i.e. out of prison. And that number, roughly, according to the numbers that I've looked at, is about 45 million people, which is an incredibly astonishing number. In addition to that, it's also important to see how we look at this relative to the rest of the globe. And we can look at other sort of countries that are close by to us. And this is a graphic that I put together from some data that comes from World Prison Brief data, which tracks some of this information. And you can see that the United States leads the world in the total number of people that it incarcerates. We're ahead of China, Brazil, India, Russia, and there's sort of some changing terminology around this, but you'll notice that we are a leader not only globally, but among the developed world as well. And that's something that's particularly striking when you consider also the rate of incarceration. So not just the total number of people, but the percentage of people, the proportion that are in prison relative to other countries. You can see here the United States is, again, an international sort of, we lead the pack here. It's about 600 people per 100,000 are incarcerated or under some form of supervision by the criminal justice system. I believe the exact number is around 629 per 100,000 people. This information changes a little bit from year to year. So, knowing that sort of as the framework for what we're dealing with, it's important to identify and go back to what concretely does the prosecutor have in the way of power, and why are they the most or one of the most important actors. And a lot of the research that I did for the book, which is the collection of a lot of reporting and other analysis, kind of boils it down to 4 key areas. And we'll start first with leverage and bail negotiations. Now, this looks different from jurisdiction to jurisdiction. There have been a lot of changes here in New York State's law regarding bail reform. But it's generally true that across the country, when you go in for a criminal trial, you're going to be arraigned when you're arrested. You're going to go before a court, and you're going to plead guilty or not guilty. And usually during that hearing, the judge is going to set a bail amount. Now, it's important to identify what bail is and what bail is not. Bail, historically, is actually mentioned in our Constitution, and is a mechanism to return people to court. In the United States, you're constitutionally considered innocent until proven guilty. So it's important to understand that the function is to make sure that you make your court appearances, that you show up, and that you go through the process. And what's important with this is that the prosecutor has a tremendous amount of leverage in determining what that bail is. They'll make a request, and then the judge can consent to it. And what's important is recent research has shown that prosecutors' bail requests have a considerable impact on judges' release and bail decisions at arraignment in New York City. This was obviously prior to the changes in the bail laws. The analysis really showed that there's a connection. And I think some degree of this connection is somewhat intuitive in that the prosecutor represents the government. The judge is part of the judiciary, which is an organ of the government. They regularly encounter each other in this work, and there's a degree of credibility that the government has with itself, for lack of a better term. So tremendous weight in bail negotiations. Furthermore, the prosecutor's bail requests were linked to the likelihood of conviction and the severity of the sentence for convicted defendants, and not the likelihood of failure to appeal. And what this is basically saying here is that folks that are sort of doing their time behind bars, waiting for the resolution of their case, that can have a substantial impact on one's likelihood of being convicted at all, and also the severity of the sentence. And this is a manifold sort of phenomenon that has a bunch of different implications that I'm happy to talk about maybe during the question and answers. The second pillar here is charging discretion. Now, this is second in this list, but I submit that this is the most important, at least as far as I can tell. And a helpful sort of way of identifying and concretizing this is looking at, this is a quote from the ACLU that says, prosecutors are the gatekeepers of the criminal legal system. They decide whether to prosecute and what to charge. And this sounds very simplistic, but it's very important because the prosecutor determines what part of the criminal law they're going to prosecute you on. An example that I like to give, there's another book called Charged by a professor and journalist named Emily Bazelon that talks about this young man who was, I believe, 17 when he was arrested for possession of a gun. And he was not using the gun, did not brandish it to officers, did not hurt anyone, but initially was charged with, I believe it was criminal possession of a weapon in the second degree, which in this state is considered a violent crime. Now, violence is a term of art in legalese, in that the legislature can determine what is and isn't violent. It oftentimes has an association with what we would colloquially consider violence: murder, rape, assault, things like that. But in this case, simply having the loaded gun on his person was a violent offense. So, charging that also carried with it a potential exposure to a mandatory minimum term of incarceration in state prison. In other words, prosecutor files that charge. By law, if he's convicted, he has to spend time in a state penitentiary. The prosecutor, in this case, actually did decide to charge him with attempted criminal possession of a weapon, which has a different sentencing structure, where prison is not mandatory. They can work with different alternative methods if they so choose. And in that gentleman's case, he was put into what we call a diversion program for youth to avoid a criminal conviction. Unfortunately, he, according to the literature I've read, is doing well and graduated from it. So, third, plea bargaining. This is, again, something that may sort of be common knowledge, but the prosecutor also can determine whether to plead you out. And what that means is that instead of going through the long and drawn-out process of a criminal trial, which is very expensive, can be very traumatic for everyone involved, and also depending on how the strength of evidence against the person, the prosecution can offer a plea bargain. And a plea bargain, I take this, I believe it's page 29 in my book, that says that defines plea bargaining as an arrangement between the prosecution and defense that permits a usually more lenient sentence or less severe charges in exchange for a guilty plea. So as you can see, in the case that I just sort of talked about, there was negotiations that ultimately led to a plea to a lesser charge, in exchange for a guilty plea. Importantly, with plea bargaining, and this is something that is always striking, there's about 30 million cases that go through state court each year, and about 1 million that go through federal court. Now, this is obviously much larger than 2 million, and the reason why is because not everyone is convicted, and not everyone that even is convicted goes to prison. But it's still a staggeringly large number of people, and 97% of criminal cases in state and federal court are adjudicated through plea bargains, which means they don't go to trial, they go through this alternative negotiation that the prosecutor is typically the one that initiates and has the initial leverage on those negotiations. Very seldom do people go to trial, for a number of reasons connected to, again, how expensive, drawn out, and complicated it can be. And this last piece here on sort of the power pillars, if you will, is accountability. And as I see it, this has two prongs. First is adhering to constituents' interest. We have about 2,300 district attorneys across the United States. In 47 states, we elect them in partisan political elections where you go to the ballot box and you elect your district attorney as a public figure. New Jersey, and I believe Rhode Island is the other one, appoint their prosecutors and have them confirmed by the legislature. And the District of Columbia also has a sort of a unique configuration where the federal government represents them in criminal cases. And they're also appointed by the president and confirmed by the Senate. The second is correcting for misconduct within ranks. And again, kind of tied to the first thing, because they're public officials, there's demands and things that they have to meet to their constituents, because at some level, they're politicians. But the second component is when they get it wrong. So in the case of Mr. Lewis, where we talked about, where the district attorney was elected, there is a tremendous amount of power that the prosecutors have to correct mistakes and misconduct within their own ranks. Now, in some cases, there may be special prosecutors that are appointed to handle stuff that goes on in district attorney's offices that is not on the level. Some states may use their state attorney general to investigate instances, and sometimes even federal prosecutors will get involved in instances like these if they involve a violation of civil or constitutional rights. But it goes to show that there is a tremendous sort of power that they have to correct their own. They represent the government, and they're going to be correcting people when they break the law, which misconduct is breaking the law. So there's tremendous power in how they exercise that. A little voting box, might as well all to vote. So, in prosecution and in criminal justice, as I was going through and kind of looking at the different prosecutors across the country and what they're doing, specifically the ones that style themselves as reformer or progressive prosecutors, I kind of identified like 3 different groups that I consider these things in. And this has application to other areas of criminal justice as well. The first is what we'll call the preservers. The preservers, generally speaking, want to preserve the status quo. The way prosecution has historically operated, which oftentimes has an emphasis on what we'd call, again, tough on crime, or using the carceral system or prison system to sort of solve these issues. And what's important to distinguish here is this is not a right or left-wing issue. There are people that fall on both ends of the spectrum with preservers. So some of you may remember Mayor Giuliani here had a very sort of specific crime agenda that focused again on getting a lot of people off the street in line with his broken windows theory of policing. But he was a Republican. When Mayor Bloomberg came, he was a Republican, Democrat, and Independent, so he checks all 3 boxes. But he was from a different political party and also had what we would call this sort of traditional approach to criminal justice, preserving the status quo, preserving kind of what these prosecutors do in this space. Second is the purists. Now, these are people that, or a community that is really sort of these vocal advocates for reform, and this also runs the gamut. So there's been a lot of conversation in recent year with the murder of George Floyd and other instances of police abuse where you've seen these movements coming up with defund the police or defund, prosecution even. And this is important to kind of qualify because within that whole space, you have some people that do earnestly want to get rid of cops, they want to get rid of prosecutors, prisons, everything. Then there's other people that say, no, we don't need to do that in its entirety, but we need to fundamentally change things at a radical level and make it look radically different. And you see a lot of academics, a lot of professors, a lot of other lawyers and activists that fall within this. And there's a lot of ideas that come from this that when they're put into practice, will look, maybe not exactly like what they're advocating for, but it's sort of an incremental approach. So we do get some ideas from them in the criminal justice space. The last is the realist, and this is sort of an attempt to kind of create a middle ground. And the prosecutors that I look at in the book are either willingly or sort of unwillingly in this categorization. They have to work with the tools that are at their disposal. You can have a prosecutor that's elected, but if your line prosecutors or the ADAs that are prosecuting all these cases on the day-to-day, you can't micromanage and control for all of those decisions. And that's operated a little differently. In Philadelphia, for example, there were a lot of prosecutors that were fired when Larry Krasner got elected because they didn't share his vision of what he wanted prosecution to be. The former district attorney in Suffolk County, which is in Boston, took a little bit of a different approach and tried to work with what she had and did try to dismiss people and faced a lot of pushback and opposition. So they have to work within the confines that they're doing, and they want to take and listen to concerns of both of these groups, the purists that want to radically reform the system, and the preservers that say, there's really not a lot of stuff wrong, and then that we really shouldn't be messing with the soup, so to speak. And they have to navigate the complex political and just real work realities of what it means to be in criminal law enforcement. So now, this is the specific type of prosecutor that I talk about in the book and gave you some examples in different cities around the country. What is the progressive prosecutor? Now, immediately this sounds like it has political connotations, and you're not entirely wrong. Progressive prosecutors tend to be more from the Democratic Party or from other left-leaning organizations, but again, this is not to say that this is solely a right versus left-wing issue. And that applies to criminal justice more broadly as well. But for purposes of really crystallizing and understanding, I found this definition that I put in the book that comes from a reporter at the Washington Post named Mark Berman, who really tells us what is a progressive prosecutor. And as they're generally known, have been elected on platforms that included abandoning cash bail, declining low-level charges, not pursuing marijuana cases, and closely scrutinizing police conduct in efforts to reform a system that they say over-incarcerates and disproportionately punishes poor people and racial minorities. Now, each of these, again, are not cookie cutter. Each district attorney may have different emphases on different ones of these issues, and in fact may have more or less of what this definition has here. But it's very helpful to kind of understand when somebody says progressive prosecutor or a reform prosecutor, really kind of what they're getting at, because these are common themes across a lot of them. And these are some of the prosecutors. I talk about each of them to varying degrees in my book. On the left here is Mr. Krasner, who's the Philadelphia DA, who was involved in Mr. Lewis's case, as you saw in the beginning, with his exoneration. Rachel Rollins, who is the former Suffolk County District Attorney, who was recently confirmed by the United States Senate as the United States Attorney for the District of Massachusetts, where she's the head federal prosecutor. Stephanie Morales, who's the Commonwealth Attorney, also District Attorney. Chicago and Virginia have different names, but Commonwealth Attorney for Portsmouth, Virginia. Kim Fox, who's the State's Attorney for Chicago, and then Eric Gonzalez, who some of you may recognize as he is the District Attorney in Kings County, which is in Brooklyn. And I figure for purposes of this, I talk about each of these in the chapters, again, with different emphases. But for purposes of tonight, we're just going to focus on, since we're in New York, Mr. Gonzalez. But before getting to him, it's important to note that he had a predecessor, Ken Thompson. Ken Thompson was the District Attorney before Eric Gonzalez, and sort of was really one of the first introductions to this new type of prosecutions, new modality of and approach to resolving criminal cases. And a little bit about him: he was a former federal prosecutor, so he worked here in the actually we're in the Southern District right now, but Brooklyn's in the Eastern District, where he worked alongside the now former Attorney General Loretta Lynch. And he prosecuted a range of cases, some of which involved drug trafficking, guns, but some of his unique cases involved instances of police abuse, or instances where officers of the court or other members of the government abused people when they weren't supposed to. And one of the most famous or infamous instances of this was the prosecution of the Volpe case. Mr. Volpe was a police officer here in New York City that responded to a disturbance at a nightclub one evening, and arrested this gentleman named Abner Luima, and took him to the station. They beat him on the ride to the police station and then proceeded to brutally sexually assault him with a nightstick. And this was made headlines, and it was a terrible, terrible ordeal. And Mr. Volpe was tried and convicted and sent to prison. And I believe this is still accurate to say. I haven't checked the figures recently, but the civil suit that followed when he sued the city was the largest police settlement for police abuse in the city's history. So really sort of an incredible event. And tied in with that, and really I think for some of his work on the Volpe case, was a critic of police violence, instances where police officers do what they're not supposed to do. And he challenged a long-term incumbent, who was a gentleman named Joseph Heinz, who I believe went by Joe Heinz. And a funny story about him is when he beat Mr. Heinz in the Democratic primary, Mr. Heinz ran on the Republican ticket, but Mr. Thompson still prevailed. And he kind of did with his office a little bit of what we were discussing before about what progressive prosecutors do. And one of this, and it was very early on, was halting marijuana prosecutions. Now there's a sort of changing tenor in this country about how we respond to drug crime, and what utility do we really get out of putting people in prison that may be accused of low-level nonviolent drug offenses. And even those that don't go to prison, those that are arrested, because when you're arrested, the way the FBI tracks this data, you have a criminal record, and things like that will follow you. So halting that and carving out some limited exceptions for sort of large-scale dealing or other instances where maybe it involves another crime. Conviction Review Unit. This is very similar to Mr. Krasner and what we saw in the beginning with Mr. Lewis. Revisiting cases anew to try to exonerate those wrongfully convicted. Hold law enforcement accountable, which is something that we already kind of talked about on the previous slide, and renewed focus on diversion. Diversion is very complicated, but it's basically an alternative route to going to prison. So you see a lot of these in the state now and around the country that are focused on drug crime. So you hear drug courts, sometimes there's instances where there's mental health courts, and this is an attempt in certain circumstances to kind of triage cases and understand, are we going to get anything with incarcerating this person, or can we deal with this in an alternative way? This is very common with juveniles. As I referenced before with the gun case in Brooklyn. So it's an alternative way. But Unfortunately, Mr. Thompson, shortly into his tenure, died of pancreatic cancer suddenly, and it was very unfortunate. And he was succeeded by Eric Gonzalez, who's the current district attorney, who's actually an alum of Cornell University, so shout out there. But what was a little interesting about him and his background is he was the first Latino DA in Brooklyn, and he was a career prosecutor. Unlike Mr. Thompson, who had been a prosecutor but worked in some other environments, this man, right out of law school, started as an assistant district attorney in Brooklyn, and has had pretty much every single job there. Different types of crime, the trial level, supervisory positions, and he grew up in East New York and Williamsburg. And East New York, a neighborhood here in New York City that has an incarceration rate and crime average that's well above the city's average and well above the national average as well. And the important thing here is that it wasn't just sort of this random guy that chose to become a prosecutor. There was some lived experience here where he had friends and family in some cases that either had experienced incarceration or were somehow proximate to it, people that died in violence and things like that. So there was sort of a dimension of he had a community outlook and knowing that a lot of the people that were coming to his desk, in some cases he had kind of encountered at various different points in his life, not necessarily the individual people themselves, but the type of things that were leading to that. And shortly before he rose to the position that he's at now, he was counsel to DA Thompson, where he was the chief legal advisor that was basically charged with implementing the reform agenda. So he was very sort of familiar with this. And there's two things here that are worth focusing on. First is the conviction review unit, which we've kind of looked at a little bit with Philadelphia. And in Brooklyn, it operates very similarly. What's particularly important about the conviction review unit is they look at all cases, and legalese would be de novo. They don't accept any of the initial facts as necessarily true, and they revisit them carefully to try to get to the bottom of what happened. Now, this moves a little bit slow sometimes because, one, you want to get the right person. You don't want to release, necessarily the wrong person. And in some cases, witnesses may have moved, may have passed, these sorts. But it's important to kind of show that this is not just, sort of a one-off thing. Since 2014, where there was sort of a precursor to this program from what I understand, but it's been really revitalized by Mr. Thompson and Mr. Gonzalez. Since 2014, here's just sort of some faces of people that were exonerated for, again, crimes they didn't commit, which is very important. I submit that one person that's in jail wrongfully or in prison wrongfully is too many. It's, how we respond to those challenges is, of course, very important, but it's unconscionable to have people in prison there for stuff that they did not do. So this is one of the reforms that he's been really focused on, is this renewed emphasis on correcting for old mistakes and holding people accountable where they have failed either unknowingly or knowingly. And the second sort of unique prong of thing that he's starting is a parole and clemency unit. So in this state, and in a lot of states, there are varying circumstances in which you can go to the parole board to ask to be let out of prison. You could say, I've changed, I've transformed, maybe I've taken education classes, maybe I've gotten treatment, and I've served a significantly longer, for a very, very long time. And the parole board determines if that person is suitable to be released into the community. The default position generally is the district attorney opposes these petitions. They go to the parole board or they send, sometimes it's a very simple form, or memo that they send that opposes generally the release of people. But this is changing in Brooklyn, where the district attorney is taking an approach that if somebody has served the minimum portion of their sentence or falls within something that is similar to that, the presumption will be released, and that they'll recommend that the person be released back into the community and be able to start the journey of reentry so that they don't come back to prison. And it's important because this provokes a lot of questions about, how long people are in prison for and what really the return on it is. Because people that go to prison, and depending on how long the sentence is, the intuitive connection is that we're making our community safer. The more people that are in prison for longer, the safer we will be. And there's a lot of research that's actually pushing back against that and says that at a certain point there's a diminishing return for some of these very, very long sentences. And that number fluctuates depending on which sort of analysis you're looking at. But 20 years, folks, is a long time. And people, I encourage you all to ask, are you the same person that you were 20 years ago? So it's very important when considering sort of these conversations. Now, this is a quick look at Brooklyn, but I'm going to close here with kind of two things. First is the road ahead, of course, is the road ahead, where this is not a finished movement. There's a lot of things that we still have to pay attention to, and there's 4 key areas. The first is rigorous impact metrics and sophisticated analysis. A lot of these prosecutors are very new. Mr. Krasner, for example, was elected in 2018. For you, and there's a lot of questions, and you'll see this in the media now of, so-and-so prosecutor is causing crime to spike in our communities, or crime is rising. But what's important is to really look at the details and what causal analysis is being done. And the short answer is there's not a lot of great data right now, and we need to focus on actually rigorously studying this. Because if it doesn't work, then yes, we should make changes. But if it does work and we make our community safer, and we're giving people that have served their time a second chance to, continue to be in the community, then I think it's worth doing. But we need to, again, be very particular about what we're looking at and not sort of succumb to just, these very, very broad level correlative analysis that don't control for a lot of other factors. Second is voter engagement and issue literacy. So I always like to do this, and for those of you that are not from Brooklyn or live in Brooklyn, or just show of hands of who knows who their district attorney is. Awesome. It's well above a lot of people. There's a strikingly small percentage of people that actually know, and a function of this is that they're oftentimes down-ballot candidates, which means that they're eclipsed by other candidates like the presidential or congressional representatives that are on the ballot. And it's in the book here. I believe 85% of incumbent district attorneys run unopposed in elections, which is striking, that they just sort of continue their campaign unchallenged, and 95% of those will win re-election. So it's very rare that a district attorney gets challenged, and when they do, it's very, very important for voters to understand who they're voting for and why. Regardless of whether you support this model of prosecution or not, it's important to know who you're voting for, and I think that kind of holds true across a variety of different areas, not just prosecution. Confronting the problem of violence, and I dedicate a whole chapter in the book to this, where there is a lot of rhetoric in criminal justice reform that mistakenly associates mass incarceration solely with non-violent drug offenders that are in prison. That's not true. Most of the people that are serving time in prison are there for term of art violence crimes and outright violent crimes. And when we talk about trying to address problems of mass incarceration, it necessitates a confrontation with this very difficult question and asks us to really do hard thinking and analysis with regard to how we want to carry criminal justice reform forward while still accounting for this very, very big problem. The last thing is multifaceted reforms across institutions. This does not operate at all in a vacuum. There's lots of things that affect these outcomes, courts, police, prosecutors, and things that are adjacent totally to the criminal justice system, but still have a connection and impact at certain levels. So things like good schools, access to good food, sustainable and safe, affordable housing. Lots of things that impact criminal justice reform at various levels. It's not in a vacuum. And I want to close with this before we turn to questions. As I said in the beginning, I had the tremendous privilege of being educated at a Jesuit high school, which one of my colleagues is here tonight joining me from. And the current Pope, Pope Francis, is from the Jesuit order and has really taken a remarkably sort of particular tone with regard to how the church and global society treats people that are incarcerated and people that are affected by them, their families, their loved ones, because it's not just the people. And I leave you with this, that the whole church, in fidelity to the mission received from Christ, is called to show the most vulnerable people the mercy of God. We will be judged by this. And I leave that with you. I deliver this to a gathering of prison chaplains. If you don't take my word for it, take the Pope's. So that's all I have. Thank you so much. I'm happy to take any questions.
Well, I feel like we could have, hours of conversation with you, and I think, everybody understands that prisons will be with us forever. There will always be a certain number of people in our world who are violent, and I don't know that deserve incarceration is the right phrase, but will be incarcerated. I think one of the interesting conversations we had before tonight started was, what we don't often think about is what we excel at as well in the United States is incarcerating young people. It's one thing when somebody's really and truly a hardened criminal and the system can't do much for them, but when people, say, 15 to 20 get incarcerated, and you do want them to be reformed, you do want this to, in some way, help them, what we've not done a good job of necessarily on the other side is providing services to help them. And, maybe, some comments about what your nonprofit is doing, because, if you're very, very young and you make a stupid mistake and you end up in jail, what you hope the outcome will be is that you get your high school diploma, if you didn't get it before you went into prison, you in some way take advantage of training opportunities that are available in some youth offender detention centers. But what we were discussing before is that often these people end up completely unemployable, that the instant you disclose you've been in prison, you can't get hired. And how do we invest in opportunities to help those people?
Yeah, no, it's an excellent question, and it's something that really is something that's close to my heart with the work that I do with Thrive for Life. And I talk about this a little bit in the book, is you identify some pretty important problems, is that it's not just in prison what happens, but people coming back. People are happy to get released, but having a criminal record is an incredible, incredible barrier to a lot of things. Jobs, in some cases education, housing. And when you put somebody in that environment, you put them on a track often that leads them back. So of the roughly, I think it's about 500 or 600,000 folks that return each year from jail and prison, 70% will be back in 3 years, which is astonishing. It's a very, very high failure rate as a society in terms of we are correcting things. These are called correctional institutions, but we're sending so many people back. What's interesting, and this has overlap with the work that I do with Thrive for Life, is that when you provide those sort of holistic services that you're talking about, or that holistic support, you have remarkably different outcomes. And education is actually something that plays a very interesting role. And the statistics, again, are striking. It's about 14% of people with an associate's will go back to prison. That number drops to around 6% with someone that has a bachelor's degree, and it goes down to 0% with someone that has a graduate degree. And there's a multitude of reasons for that. Education is transformative for a number of reasons. I can say that just as a recent college student, that's opened me up to new ways of thinking, to new networks. And also, in a very sort of practical sense, it's a credential. A lot of college, a lot of jobs, I think it's somewhere upwards of 60 to 65% now require some form of a degree, whether it's an associate's or a bachelor's. So to answer your question about what we can do more, we need to focus very heavily on the reentry aspect of things. There's a professor of mine who was a tremendous resource for this book that has decades of experience at various levels with the criminal justice system. And he said something that has kind of stuck with me, which is you need to start planning for the day they get out, the day they get there. And that rings true because they're very complicated issues. You have to control for a lot of things. And yeah, there will be some people that fail. It's my own personal opinion that no human being is incorrigible or beyond redemption, and that we should minister to them. That's what I believe as a Catholic. But also, it really has, I think, applicability across the board because, look, we spend a lot of money on prison, a lot. And crime does have harm. And if we can correct from that happening again by providing reentry services, that'd be great. And the really three things that I think are important are gainful employment, not just employment like, sort of going to a job that you hate or that doesn't pay well, but really you wake up in the morning and say, hey, it's work, but I gotta go. And I enjoy what I'm doing. The second is safe and stable housing. That's very important, where we go home to sleep, where we go home to work, spend time with our families. That's crucially important. And then I'd submit, just based on the work that we've done with Thrive for Life, that education is very important as well. And that takes different forms. Some people are going to be better suited for vocational education. We need to emphasize that more in this country. Some people are better suited for associates or bachelors. And everybody is a unique case that needs to be ministered to accordingly. And that's what we try to do with Thrive for Life as a company. We call them resident scholars that come back so that they have the tools necessary to succeed, to thrive, if you will, and to not go back to prison. Yeah.
I've been probation officer for over 20 years.
Mm-hmm.
Young people to a little bit older young people. And we have a gamut of resources, education, schooling, trades, jobs. We have a gamut of it. I would love to see that prior to my office. Because the older population already has that family connection, already has the young, they come with so many needs, and now we have this. I would love to see this, all we have implemented at a much younger age. I would have less of a job. I'm okay with that. I'm really okay with that.
I used to work at the DA's office, and I had some colleagues that said something similar, where it's like, yeah, but we can correct for these before, yeah.
Yeah, correct. Yeah, I would love to be able to say beforehand that you can go here, try this out, do that. And I do it like outside of work, just in my community, because you know that there's a population that requires this.
Yes.
And it's so frustrating. I mean, we're gonna help, right? Because that's
Yeah.
our job, but I would love to see it somewhere else.
Yeah.
In a school, in a program, something before
Yeah.
that arrest.
And this goes back to sort of, what's your name, ma'am? Carrie Ann. Thank you for coming and for that contribution. It goes right back to what she was saying with this multifaceted institutions, that there's things that we can do to prevent this from happening in the first place, where we don't have to encounter people beyond the prison walls. We can prevent it from happening. I talk about this in the book, but there's an interesting program that the Commonwealth Attorney in Portsmouth is doing, where she focuses exactly on that, is investing in particularly youth communities, to show them what's involved with civic engagement. Your office offers a pathway internship program to get people in the community involved with government and the work that she does, so that they do those things. And built into that is this encouragement to continue with your studies, that there's a payout with education. And that really, I certainly don't have to tell you, based on your experience, that prison's very bad. There's a lot of bad stuff that goes on in prison. And despite the title of corrections, there's a lot of people, including people that are employed there and people that are obviously incarcerated there, that don't really get corrected, so to speak, and in some cases may actually come out worse off than they entered. And preventing that, I totally agree. And I think education is something that doesn't just start with higher education, it's that emphasis at a very early age. It's a very interesting sort of issue in our country right now with the closure of schools during the pandemic. There were a lot of children that didn't necessarily benefit or were comfortable with Zoom learning, and in some cases people come from different backgrounds. Maybe the Wi-Fi is bad, maybe there's not a place to really sit down and study, do stuff, and that affected school attendance rates. And in some of these communities that are more underserved or at risk, that's when bad things happen, is that when you turn away from school and the structure and the environment, and you go into the community and doing things that you're not supposed to, that may end up landing you in prison. So totally agree. And I'd love to see more of that too.
I have a question.
Yes, sir.
Going back to your statistics,
Sure.
what is the split on white-collar crime versus violent crime?
Yeah.
And not to defend the United States, but most of those countries don't prosecute what we prosecute, right? Especially on the white-collar side. And a big reason why they don't have people in jail is because they kill them, right? And thirdly, they all lie about their statistics. I've lived abroad for many years, and I've seen a lot, and I've been on both sides of the aisle, especially in this city, where corruption is not only in the crime, but in the prosecutor's office and in the political offices. So there's a whole gamut of, what causes this issue. So aside from those statistics, because I'd be interested to see what that really is, and I have to get into this other meeting. I haven't read your book yet, but what are you trying to achieve, you personally, in writing this book? What is it that you're looking for?
That answer, so a couple answers. That question I can answer though immediately and say that I want people to be interested in this topic. I myself, have a lot to learn as a professional, as a student, but I want people to be engaged in this, and this is an issue area that's very controversial and very sort of, in the news, but there's a lot of conversations that talk past each other, where people don't know what's actually going on at various different levels. So I want people to be engaged and interested in the subject matter, particularly people that, may want to get involved, may want to understand these things, sort of a place to start. Because a lot of the higher up experts know a lot of this information already. To answer your other question about the breakdown of white-collar crime versus others, I don't have the numbers totally offhand, but the data that I pulled the first graphic for, which is the prison population, actually it was something else. So the Prison Policy Initiative publishes this data and breaks it down specifically by crime and what type of crime. And it's interesting because it's different in the state versus the federal system. In the federal system, you're entirely correct that there's a lot more white-collar crimes that get prosecuted because of the federal government's jurisdiction that violates laws that Congress passes concerning securities, other stuff like that. In the state system, it's much smaller. I don't have the exact percentages off the top of my head, but it is a smaller percentage. One thing too that I wanted to also, I appreciate you bringing this up, is that this idea of the statistics that we get from other countries with regard to their rates of incarceration, it's important who is defining what. So a very big example right now is there's an ongoing controversy in China with the incarceration of Uyghur Muslims in Xinjiang, and the Chinese do not count that as part of their incarceration rate. And that's roughly, it's estimated to be about, according to some human rights groups, about 1 million people. So yes, these numbers do change. And even within the United States, as I said, 2 million plus is probably a good number to start with. Some go as high as 3 million or even more, depending on what types of confinement you're talking about. And all of those have different degrees of involvement with criminal justice. But yeah, no, it's a very important distinction. Thank you for raising that. Yeah. Yes?
I'm curious, you mentioned in the beginning of your presentation the countries that were somewhat around the United States in terms of rates of incarceration, quantity and rate. And I'm curious if in your research you came across any countries that stand out as models for a way to do this better.
Yeah, so before I end the book, I talk about an example in Germany where it's particularly sort of instructive. So there was a prosecutor in Santa Clara County, who I believe is still the district attorney there, although he may be up for election, named Jeff Rosen, who gave a TED Talk to a group of high school students about incarceration and our sort of trends relative to the rest of the world. And he really anchored it in this discussion of a visit that a group of other politicians and other folks had with, they made a trip to Germany to visit a prison there. And it was radically different. First, in Germany, prisons look very different. I'm sure the visuals of these, like oftentimes what you see sometimes on television and the news about decrepit prison conditions, unfortunately, is very, very true in the United States. It looks markedly different in Germany. They have their own cells, which some people here have their own cells, but it depends on where you are. There's far more of an emphasis on the sort of rehabilitative and supportive services aspect and social work training of correctional officers. It's actually very, very hard to become a correctional officer in Germany. Very, very high, very, very few applicants prevail in that. They also have their own, they cook their own meals with utensils that in the United States would be considered dangerous contraband in prisons. And they wear their own clothes. So it's a markedly different system. But what's interesting is that when you compare that to the impact, Germany has a far lower rate of incarceration to begin with, far lower rate of recidivism, and I believe I have some of the statistics in the book. I don't know them exactly offhand, but far more of an emphasis on this. And also, there's a cap, I believe, in Germany on the sentence where sentences can't go beyond 20 or 25 years. And it's aligned with research that shows that there's a diminishing return after a certain point with incarceration where communities can become you can actually harm communities more than protecting them. And there's some similarities in some jurisdictions here in the United States, but there's also an emphasis on, toward the end of your sentence in Germany, you go to what's called an open prison, which means that you leave during the day and you just got to come back at night. And during that time, they encourage you to find a job, to get education, to do other things that are going to prepare you for reentry, as we were talking about before. And there's support that comes with that. And there's a remarkably low rate of people committing crimes when they're on the outside. I think it's something to the tune of like 3%. Again, I think I mentioned it in the chapter. Now, as it concerns prosecution, it gets a little more complicated. The philosophies are a little more aligned with the actual correctional philosophy in some of those countries. But it is different. Some countries do certainly have more restrictions procedurally and constitutionally than we do in the United States. That is something that is particularly unique here, is that defendants, at least on paper, are afforded a lot of rights in the criminal process. That is not the case in a lot of other countries, even in the developed world. But Germany is a particularly interesting example. Yeah.
So I have to get to the other meeting
Yep.
for which I'm very sorry.
No worries.
Somebody double booked things. But I'm going to leave us, as I leave the room, with a note of, you don't think that history can teach you something about, our prosecution system today, but there are two very interesting examples, and one of them is a prison island off the coast of Naples called Santo Stefano. And since we're an Italian-American organization, it's germane, but it's a 17th century prison that is a ruin today, although hopefully to be restored as a visible place. But, we we don't think about the connections of words sometimes, and so, you know, prisons were originally penitentiaries because you were meant to be penitent.
Yep.
And you know, often the church was very involved in running these sites, witness Santo Stefano, and you know, it was really meant to be a place where you thought about the crime you had committed. The goal was to get you released. But it's very interesting because it's very contrary to the way we run prisons today. But you know, it is sort of thought about you should not be idle. So, you know, the prisoners planted gardens and cooked the food and did a lot of things that were meant to make them engage with their fellow prisoners, you know, to form a community. And in the United States, in Philadelphia, in the 19th century, a prison called Eastern State Penitentiary was created. It now is a place you can visit, you know, as a tourist. But when it was started in Philadelphia at the time, it was modeled on Santo Stefano, and it was physically like a hub with spokes out. So the hub was where you came together for a variety of activities. It also made it easier to patrol. And then these long spokes were all individual cells where every cell opened to an outdoor space. And so you had your almost like a monk's room where you fought, but then you had this garden space that was your space to go outside, have fresh air, grow things. And it was the same idea that obviously the prison population was much smaller and it was not run the way we do today, but the whole idea was to return you to society as a penitent individual. And you know, these two places, one which you can visit, Eastern State Penitentiary, and Santo Stefano, hopefully people will be able to visit in the not too distant future because they're hoping to restore it. But they kind of, you know, make us understand that we've been struggling with this issue for a long time. Hundreds of years we've been trying to identify this. And it's interesting because you're working for a Jesuit group, and so in a lot of ways, you know, time has come full circle that we're trying once again for a more humane approach to incarceration.
And that exact, I actually forgot to mention in the example with Germany, is that when this district attorney went and visited with his group, that was one of the remarkable things, is that there was greenery and you know, people that were incarcerated had a window to look out of. And this idea that, you know, in the sort of Jesuit tradition, there's a heavy emphasis on reflection and contemplation. And that also has an impact on the work that we do. We do a lot of work behind the walls initially where we meet people, where we have retreats that are focused on and derived from this spiritual exercises of St. Ignatius of Loyola, which is about reflection, contemplation. And it's very much rooted in exactly what you're talking about, of, you know, trying to accompany people that may have done something very, very serious, but with the goal of making them not only penitent, but then functional when they go outside, and that they have, you know, something that they can look forward instead of looking back, and in some cases going back. So yes,
Well, I apologize that I have to go.
No worries.
But I hope you will come back. I hope everybody will read the book, and I hope those people who went to the meeting ahead of me but took their copies with them will also read the book.
Absolutely.
I think we have a lot to learn from you, so you know, please come back often and educate us. And I hope the LSATs were a good experience.
We'll see.
I hope you go to a school nearby so we can stay in touch with you, and can't wait to see book 2.
Absolutely, yes. I'm happy to sign any copies as well outside of the secretary. Thank you very much.
I'm very sorry I have to
No worries at all.
Thank you, this was fantastic, and please do,
Absolutely.
you know, track me down anytime you need
Fantastic.
space.